So Zack is from Tetrate, and he'll be talking about the trust and the mesh. Zero trust is one of the biggest marketing buzzwords in our industry today. We'll start by outlining. Zack, over to you.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. Just real quick, show of hands. Did anybody go to Nick Chalon's talk at 1 a little bit earlier? No? Okay. Just a few. All right. We'll talk about a couple of similar things. So, like we said in the intro, we kind of want to talk about my definition for zero trust, and I'll introduce first maybe why you should believe my definition, and then we'll talk about some frameworks that we can start to use to achieve that incrementally in our systems, and finally how the service mesh as a technology layer can help facilitate those. So a little bit about me. I was one of the original engineers on the Istio project, which is the service mesh at Google. I been running a company around this for about 4 years now, and I work actively with the National Institute of Standards and Technology to develop security standards for the US government. And in particular, I co-author the SP 800-204 series, which governs microservice security for the US government. And I apologize, some of the typography is a little bit off. We got lost in translation, so if things are a little weird, I apologize. So what does it really mean when we talk about zero trust? The framing question that I want to give y'all is, something in your network is already compromised. Given that, how do you limit the damage that an actor can do with that access? Right? And so the name of the game is really all about bounding attacks in space and in time so that we can mitigate the damage that somebody can do. I like to divide this up into kind of 4 pillars or 4 areas. The first is pre-runtime, so everything that it takes to get an artifact and run it in production. Right? And there's a ton of process, there's a ton of humans that are involved in that cycle. You know, things from code review to the build pipelines themselves. Where does the build happen? Can it be done reproducibly and hermetically? How do we actually sign those builds so that in production we can trust them? All of that stuff, the CI/CD pipelines that go into it as well. All of this needs to be addressed in some way as you're approaching a zero trust system, right? Because these pieces are critical to getting what your applications are going to do, how you get a binary into a place where it can run and how you trust that. Once it's actually running, at a minimum, I would argue that there are 5 checks that need to occur on every single request between every single set of applications in your system, not just at the front door, but all the way through your call graph. And those being, we need encryption in transit to provide message authenticity and eavesdropping protection. And then on top of that, we need to be able to authenticate and authorize the applications that are communicating to each other. And we need to be able to authenticate and authorize the end user that is in session, in transaction, and the resources that they are retrieving. And we should be able to do that, again, every hop along the way, because we would like to be able to author policy like the backend can talk to the database. We could do that with like a network ACL. We could do that with an allow list or similar. But we would like to say the backend can call the database in the presence of invalid end user credential that grants the read scope. And if the name of the game is bounding attacks in space and time, if we have a policy like that, then that means that an attacker needs to compromise a machine identity and an end user credential. Both need to be valid, and they need to have the correct scopes in the system to do the access that the attacker wants to perpetrate. That's a pretty narrow set of rings to hop through, right? We should be able to monitor then and assert the system state continuously, and we need telemetry out of the system to be able to do that. Metrics, logs, and traces that we can analyze so that we can assert and prove that the system is in compliance always. We want to then be able to feed that data into existing systems. I list anomaly detection as a placeholder for one such system, but you can imagine there's a variety of different systems that would like to be fed the runtime data of who your applications are talking to, how that communication is occurring. Did that take a long time or not? What was the latency like? All those kind of features, right? And ultimately, we want to be able to implement a moving target defense where we can look at workloads that are running, establish that they are atypical or not normal based on their existing behavior and those signals that we get, and kill them as they're running, right? So that things that aren't in compliance with what we expect just can't even run in our infrastructure. Again, dramatically increases the difficulty of perpetrating an attack, because as soon as we start to detect a workload doing things that are not normal, we can go and shut it down. And then finally, we need to administer over the top of all of this. And this is maybe the easiest one for me to say and the hardest one to go implement, because this is really about all the organizational controls that you build within your organizations over top of the technologies that implement the previous three, right? And of course, there's good stuff that we need to do there, principal of least privilege and the AAA, authenticate, authorize, and audit. But we also want to be able to, ideally, as we're pursuing a zero trust system, shift left and be able to treat our infrastructure as code, treat our policies as code, treat the entire stack as code. That also helps when we want to do things like that deletion of workloads that are atypical, right? We want to bring the system back to a true state. We want the code to tell us what the true state of the system is for us to return to. So how do we start to then achieve those things within our own organization? I want to recommend the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the CSF, as a nice tool for starting to break down and understand this space and iteratively moving yourself into a better security posture. The framework has kind of 5 key areas. You want to identify and inventory your system, establish baseline protections, detect active events, respond to those events, and ultimately recover business continuity. And across those 5 areas, the framework lays out kind of 4 tiers, or what they call it, that describe kind of how well your organization can do those 5 activities. And the answer is that maybe for your organization, based on the risk profile and the environment in which you operate, it doesn't make sense to pay the cost of going to an adaptive security posture where you can, react to and respond to events immediately and in real time. Maybe for the particular business, you can shoot for a lesser one, right? The important thing is that we want to understand where our organization is, what it's trying to achieve, the environment in which it operates, and the regulatory requirements under which it operates. And together, we should be able to establish then that security profile. The CSF actually has a variety of profiles that you can use to help map to. And then finally, you want to start to diff that against a target profile so that you can do gap analysis and figure out in concrete terms, what do we need to start to go implement, right? And for which applications. So now I'm going to change topics just a little bit. We're going to go down the stack. And so I want to talk about the service mesh in particular, which is an infrastructure layer that helps facilitate those runtime zero trust requirements. The service mesh is one of the primary subjects of that SP 800-204 series that I write with NIST. We argue in those standards that the service mesh is one of the most effective ways today to achieve those runtime security requirements that we talked about. So in particular, what is the mesh? It's a layer to help you connect, secure, manage your services consistently regardless of language or runtime. The way that it works is we take a network proxy and we put it beside every instance of your application, and it intercepts all traffic into and out of that application. And that gives us a policy enforcement point, which we can use to implement a whole bunch of really powerful primitives on behalf of the platform. That includes giving an application level identity in the form of an X509 certificate that's issued and rotated that can be used for encryption in transit as well as workload-to-workload authentication. That includes being able to do per request policy, so not at the connection and not at the edge. Because again, we're putting this next to every instance of the application. So we're not doing these checks at the perimeter, we're doing them for internal traffic as well as for north-south traffic. Resiliency and availability is very much a security concern, right? Security is a continuous trade-off between availability, reliability, and security of the system, right? And so features like service discovery, client-side load balancing, automatic retries, timeouts, and circuit breaking are all very powerful application resiliency features that also do a lot to bound the space that our system can behave in. And a more reliable, a more constrained system is going to have more predictable behavior when we're operating it in production. And then finally, we get operational metrics out of this stack as well. Telemetry, metrics on every transaction, every request through the system, logs for all of those in a standard format, as well as annotating traces if they exist. That's another kind of superpower that the mesh brings, right? The idea that we get consistent metrics with the same dimensions, with the same semantics, we get the same log lines with the same format out of every application in the fleet. So we can start to build standardized pipelines for all of our teams in the organization that leverage that data, that telemetry. And then finally, we want to be able to change all of those things dynamically at runtime. And so the service mesh gives us a control plane that operates dynamically on configuration that we can serve with a traditional CD system, treating it as infrastructure as code, to program and affect these changes on our runtime production system fast, without having to redeploy applications. When I say fast, in Istio, we can do it on the order of a couple milliseconds from policy consumption to pushing it out to the affected workloads. So Istio is the most widely adopted service mesh, and Envoy is the sidecar, the network proxy that's doing all the work that I just described. Both are Envoy is a CNCF project. Istio was actually just donated to the CNCF, which is great, and we're pretty happy about that as a community overall. Finally, I kind of want to leave you with a couple of kind of bigger ideas around this service mesh architecture. So first is that Envoy in this architecture forms a universal policy enforcement point. We have an agent intercepting all the traffic into and out of our applications at every application instance. So we can take that and use that to implement business-specific, application-specific logic if we don't want to, but we can also use it and the cross-cutting capability that the service mesh provides to start to implement security controls and security policy cross-cutting across our entire organization, leveraging Envoy as the point to enact our policy. This is an idea that we talk about at length in SB 800-204B. Given then that we have a service mesh with a universal policy enforcement point, a reference monitor, if we go back to the 1970s security literature, then the service mesh itself can become our security kernel. It can become the place that we push the constraints, the controls, as well as the eyes, the auditing, the security checks in our system to this common layer and this common set of software so that we can gain a high assurance that it is doing what we think it is doing and that it's doing it safely. We can use that assurance then as the baseline for our platform that the applications run on and the security model that they execute within. Again, this is an idea that we explore at length in 204B. And then finally, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but the service mesh itself facilitates cross-cutting change. We can go to one place, or we can have a single team author configuration or make a change that is enacted across the entire platform. So it acts as a huge force multiplier within our organizations. One of the most common use cases that we see out of the gate for the service mesh is helping facilitate encryption in transit for applications. Rather than having to go to every individual application team within the organization and do the work to get them to understand PKI, to understand X509 certificates, and implement encryption in transit for their applications, we can go to the platform team and have them deploy the sidecar, the service mesh sidecar to applications and enable it transparently without application intervention. We can do that for not just encryption in transit, but any of the service mesh features that I talked about earlier. All of them can be managed centrally or delegated down to individual teams. And this gives you a huge amount of flexibility and power to act on behalf of the entire organization. And we just blazed through this. This is all the content I have. So hopefully we have some questions to be able to talk through in the last, I think, maybe 3 minutes or so that we have. Questions, comments, concerns, rebuttals? Okay. Yes. So yeah. So so clearly it's useful. But what about how do we abuse it? Yeah, there is. So just like any other technology, right? There are avenues that you can use to start to attack the service mesh, right? One of the more common ways that we've seen is bypassing the sidecar, right? So the sidecar itself becomes incredibly important, and the mechanisms that we use to ensure that traffic goes through the sidecar rather than being able to bypass it become very important. So far today, all of the service mesh implementations, not just Istio, have leveraged kernel level, container level isolation to achieve that, right? And so that has the downsides that any containerized system has, right? And if we can escape the container, then we can bypass this on the host. And we do have then a wide range of attacks that are available to us, right? Yeah, so what about resiliency and the mesh being a single point of failure? So it's certainly the mesh can act as a single point of failure from the perspective of configuration update if we are pushing cross-cutting changes. But in general, the service mesh vastly improves the resiliency posture of applications deployed in it for a couple different reasons, but primarily because transparent to the application, we can do client-side load balancing, service discovery, retries, timeouts, circuit breaking, and outlier detection. Outlier detection in particular is really valuable. If we have a transient network partition and we can talk to some instance of our backend and not the other, because we're doing client-side load balancing, we can actually make sure that traffic goes only to the available instances and not the bad ones, right? And in that way, we can actually boost the perceived availability of a system that's partially degraded from a user's perspective. And that's kind of one of the really awesome advantages of client-side load balancing in general and the service mesh particularly. All right, do we have time for one more? Are we done? One more. Any other questions? Alrighty, awesome. Thank you.